What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the street was a dead man's chisel? What if the one person who believed in you was already gone, and everything he left behind, his tools, his trade, his quiet certainty that you were worth something, fit inside a single canvas roll you carried on your back? They said Mabel Drest was a fool for trying. A 20-year-old girl, with no family, no money, no name that meant anything in Harrow's crossing, buying a burned-out cooperage on the wrong side of the creek for next to nothing. They said the barrels she made would never hold water. They said she'd be begging for work at the cannery before the first frost. What they didn't know was what was hidden in the floorboards of that ruined shop. Pull up a chair, settle in somewhere warm, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Because we'd like to tell you the story of Mabel Drest and the cooperage on Coldwater Lane. Mabel came into Harrow's crossing on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of day where the sky can't decide whether to rain and just stays gray out of stubbornness. She came on foot because the money she had left, $11 and some coins, wasn't enough for the coach from Timmins, not if she was going to need it for something more important. Her boots had been resoled twice. The canvas roll across her shoulder held a draw knife, 2 chisels, a curved spokeshave, a block plane, and a crow's. The tools of a cooper, small and worn smooth from decades of use before they ever reached her hands. She had carried them for 3 years, since the morning she'd found old Reuben Mosey, dead in his chair by the stove. His coffee still warm, his hands folded in his lap as if he'd simply decided to rest. He had been her employer, her teacher, and the closest thing to a father she had known since the church home in Sudbury. Let her go at 16 with a coat, a pair of shoes, and the suggestion that she figure something out. Reuben had figured it out for her, in his way. Not with money, he had none to leave. Not with property. The shop he rented reverted to the landlord before the week was out. What he left her was the canvas roll, and 3 years of his knowledge pressed into her hands like heat from a fire. She knew how to read the grain of white oak. She knew how to raise a stave, how to drive a hoop, how to test a seam with her thumb, and know before water touched it whether it would hold. Coopering was a dying trade, Reuben had told her, but dying trades still need people who know them. Somebody always needs a barrel. Harrow's Crossing was a mill town gone quiet, the kind of place that had lost its reason for existing when the lumber ran thin and hadn't yet found a new one. There was a hardware store, a post office, a hotel that served as a tavern by night, and a scattering of houses along the creek that went from respectable to sorry the further you walked from the main street. At the very end of Coldwater Lane, past the point where the gravel road gave up and became 2 muddy ruts, stood the cooperage, or what was left of it. It had burned 3 years before. Not entirely. The stone foundation and the 2 outer walls of fieldstone still stood, and the chimney at the north end pointed stubbornly at the sky. But the roof was gone, and one of the interior walls had collapsed inward, filling the floor with a tangle of charred timber and old metal bands, and the rusted skeletons of half-finished barrels that had become, over time, a kind of iron garden. Weeds grew up through the debris. A stand of young birch had seated itself in the corner where the wall had fallen, white trunks, no thicker than a wrist, reaching toward the open sky. Mabel stood at the end of the lane and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She had found out about it in a letter, not written to her, but overheard in the boarding house in Timmins where she'd been doing laundry for room and board since Reuben's shop closed. 2 men talking at supper about a failed auction. The Coldwater Cooperage, they said. County tax deed. Nobody wanted it. Stone walls and a bad memory, one of them said. The other laughed. She had gone to the county office the next morning. The clerk, a thin man with a mustache that seemed to be trying to leave his face, had looked at her the way people often looked at her, with a mild, reflexive doubt, as if waiting for her to explain herself. The cooperage on Coldwater Lane, she said. The tax deed. He found it in a ledger that smelled of damp and neglect. $38. She laid 11 on the counter and asked if she could pay the remainder in monthly installments. He told her, with the kind of precision that suggests a person has enjoyed delivering bad news before, that the county didn't offer installment plans on tax deeds. She looked at the $11 on the counter. Then she looked at him. Is there anyone who'd take the other 27 as a promissory note against the deed? He hadn't expected that. He left to find someone more senior, and after 40 minutes of waiting on a bench in a hallway that smelled of pipe smoke, a heavier man in a better suit came out and told her that the county clerk of one Bernard Quinnell. He said the name as if she should recognize it, and she didn't, had agreed to hold a lien against the property until the remainder was paid, at 4% per annum. She signed where they told her to sign and walked out with a deed that was hers in every way except the $27 still owed on it. That was how Mabel Drest came to own a pile of stone and charred wood and birch saplings at the end of a lane in a town that had mostly forgotten how to thrive. She found out the rest of what the town thought about her purchase on her first morning there. She had made her camp the night before, in the lee of the standing wall, a fire in a circle of stones, her bedroll on a piece of canvas she'd spread over the cleaner section of the flagstone floor. She'd slept badly. The wind came down the valley and through the open roof like it was looking for something. And she was up before the light was full, boiling water over the fire, and eating the last of the biscuits she'd carried from Timmins. She had just begun pulling apart the nearest pile of debris, sorting charred wood from salvageable timber, when she heard boots on the lane. The man who appeared at the ruined doorway was large and unhurried, with the kind of face that had settled into permanence around age 40 and declined to change after that. He wore a good coat. He introduced himself as Aldous Crane. She recognized the name from the deed, the same Crane who'd owned the building before the fire, and he looked around the wreckage with an expression caught between amusement and pity. Heard the county finally moved it, he said, not to her exactly, but in her direction. Mabel set down the length of timber she'd been carrying. They did, and you're the one that moved it. I am. He walked in a slow half-circle near the doorway, his hands in his pockets, surveying. He kicked at a rusted hoop with the toe of his boot. I'll give you what you paid for it, he said. The whole 38. Save you the trouble. I haven't started the trouble yet. He looked at her then properly, for the first time. She was smaller than he'd expected, she could tell. They always expected someone larger when they heard a woman had done something they found surprising. He looked at the canvas roll she'd leaned against the wall. He looked at her hands. You know coopering? He asked. I know coopering. Reuben Most teach you? She paused. You knew him? Bought barrels from him 20 years ago, before the trade moved to Sudbury. He looked at the canvas roll again. Those his tools? Yes. Something shifted in his face then. Not warmth exactly, but something that was no longer skepticism. He nodded, once the way a man nods when he's recalibrated an assumption and doesn't particularly want to admit it. There's no market for barrels here anymore, he said. The mill's done. The cannery uses tin. I'm not planning to make barrels for the mill. He waited. She didn't elaborate. After a moment he made a small sound, not quite a laugh, and walked back up the lane the way he'd come. She watched him go, then picked up the timber again and went back to work. The rest of the town's opinion arrived more gradually. The way weather does. She felt it in the hardware store, where the man behind the counter, a wide, careful person named Duncan Pride, who she came to understand owned most of what there was to own in Harrow's Crossing, watched her select lime and fiber for mortar. With an expression of mild, bewildered condescension, she felt it in the hotel, where she took one meal a day to save the trouble of cooking, and where the tables went quieter when she sat down. She felt it in the glances from the women who walked the main street in the morning, who saw her coming back from the cooperage with her coat, dusty, and her hair pinned back under a kerchief, and drew the conclusions people draw when they see a young woman doing work they associate with men. It was at the hardware store, on her third day, that she met Pride face to face in a way that required more than a transaction. He was speaking to another customer when she came in, and he finished his thought before turning to her, which told her something about where she ranked. When he did turn, he looked her over with the particular expression of a man who has decided in advance that he will be patient. Miss Drest, he said. Already he knew her name, which meant the town had been talking. I heard you've taken on the Coldwater property. I have. That's a significant undertaking for. He paused in a way that managed to be both delicate and pointed. For one person. It is, she agreed. He leaned on the counter. I own the lot adjacent. Bought it intending to extend my lumber yard, before the yard went quiet. I'd pay you a fair price for the cooperage building. The stone's good, worth more than what's standing on it. And you'd come out ahead of your $11, clear of the lien, and free too. He waved a hand. Try something more suited. It was almost word for word what Aldous Crane had said. She was beginning to understand the grammar of how the town addressed her. I appreciate the offer, Mabel said. I'd like 40 feet of half-inch hemp rope, please, and a small pry bar if you have one. Pride's face did something that was not quite a smile. No one's managed to make anything of that building in 20 years, he said as he moved to find the rope. Before the fire, it barely paid. After it, he set the rope on the counter. I'm not trying to discourage you. I just think you deserve an honest picture. That's the second offer I've had in 3 days, Mabel said, counting out her coins. If the building's worthless, I wonder why 2 men want it back so quickly. Pride said nothing. She took her rope and her pry bar and went back to the lane. It was on her way back that she met Vera. She almost missed her. An old woman sitting on a stump at the edge of the tree line where the lane curved, wrapped in a blanket despite a day that wasn't cold, watching the creek with the self-contained patience of someone who has learned that most things worth seeing require waiting. She had the dark, weathered look of someone who had lived outside more than in, and eyes the particular shade of gray that tends to see further than most. "Cooper's girl," the woman said without preamble. Mabel stopped. "I'm sorry? That's what they're calling you." She didn't look up. "Worse than that, some of them." Mabel set down her rope. "And what do you call me?" The old woman looked at her then. "I call you the one who noticed the floor." Mabel frowned. "I haven't finished clearing the floor." "No," the woman said. "But you will." She turned back to the creek. "Ezra Holt built that cooperage. Not just for barrels." Mabel waited, but the old woman said nothing more. After a moment, she picked up the rope and walked on. She thought about those words all through the afternoon, working her way along the western wall with the pry bar, pulling out charred beams one by one. Ezra Holt. She had seen the name in the deed records, the original builder 50 years back. She'd assumed he was a cooper. What else would build a cooperage? What else would Vera mean? The question lodged in her like a splinter, small and irritating and impossible to ignore. She had cleared roughly half the floor by the end of that first week. It was killing work. Each beam had to be levered free, dragged out, assessed. The good wood went in one pile, the charred and ruined in another for burning. The birch saplings she cut carefully, saving the straightest ones to use as replacement staves in the wall frames she was planning. Her hands bled through the first 2 days until the blisters became calluses. Her back ached with a specificity that told her exactly which muscles she had been neglecting. But the floor was coming clear, and the floor was something. Reuben had told her once that the oldest cooperages had flagstone floors because the moisture coming up through the earth kept the wood from drying too quickly on the bottom course. She hadn't thought about it much at the time. Now she found herself looking at the flags as she uncovered them, broad, uneven slabs of limestone, most cracked along one edge, all smoke-stained from the fire, and thinking about the hands that had laid them. Ezra Holt, she thought, not just for barrels. On the 8th day she found the first one. She was prizing up a warped section of what had been the workshop's secondary floor. A wooden platform raised 6 inches above the flagstone where the turning tools had been set up, when her pry bar slipped and went down between 2 flags and struck something that sounded wrong. Not the hollow clunk of an air pocket, something else, denser. She knelt and worked her hands into the gap, sweeping away years of ash and grit, and her fingers found the edge of something flat and smooth. Wood, sealed wood, with the feeling of oil worked deep into the grain. It took her an hour to work the flagstone loose without breaking it. Underneath was a cavity, roughly the size of a bread box, lined with more oiled wood. Cedar, she thought, from the smell. And inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept its integrity better than she expected, was a flat wooden case about 12 inches long and 6 wide. She carried it out into the light and sat down on the low wall she'd just finished repointing. A crow landed on the chimney stack and watched her open it. Inside the case, in a bed of old sawdust, lay a set of chisels unlike any she had ever seen. Not for wood. The bevels were wrong for wood, too shallow, and the blades were harder. She could tell by the weight and the cold blue-gray color. One of them had a notation scratched into the handle in a tiny, careful hand. She had to hold it nearly to her nose to read it. EH, for Lyell's method. Do not use for oak. Lyell. She knew the name. A geologist. She had seen it in a book Reuben kept on the shelf above his bench. A general encyclopedia of trades and sciences that she'd read half of out of boredom during slow winters. Charles Lyell, who had written about the reading of stone. E.H. Ezra Holt. A cooper who owned geological instruments. She looked at the chisels. She looked at the stone walls around her, the fieldstone foundation, the limestone flags. Not just for barrels. The case held 3 other items. A small leather notebook, water-stained at the corners but legible within. A paper tube, which she unrolled to find a hand-drawn survey of the Coldwater Lane property, and some 20 acres of hillside behind it, annotated in the same small hand as the chisel. And a folded letter, the wax seal long since crumbled, addressed to a geological society in Toronto that she was fairly certain no longer existed. She opened the notebook first. Ezra Holt had been a self-taught geologist, the way self-taught men of that era were. Exhaustively, obsessively, with the kind of focus that comes from having no one to argue you out of your ideas. He had come to Harrow's crossing for the creek, not the lumber. The creek ran down from a ridge of pre-Cambrian granite that had, in his view, been intruded by a vein of mineral-rich pegmatite some distance uphill. He had been looking for the surface expression of that vein, he believed, from the character of the limestone in the foundation of his property and the composition of the creek sediment, that he had found it. The cooperage had been built on the site he'd chosen not because it was convenient, but because the ground itself had drawn him there. The barrels were how he paid for the research. She read for a long time as the light changed. Gideon, no. As September stretched into October, as the crow came and went from the chimney, he had found something. He was careful about what he said in the notebook, with the caution of a man who had been dismissed before and was writing for himself rather than an audience. But between the careful language and the notations on the survey map, the picture assembled itself. There was a seam. It ran diagonally under the property and up the hillside. He called it the blue-gray bed. He had followed it as far as the stone tools would let him. He wrote, on the last page he had used, "The applications are significant. The silica content alone, if properly refined, would support a glassworks. But the more interesting possibility is the feldspar. Specific type, specific quality, the kind the pottery men in Toronto have been importing from New Hampshire at considerable expense. It is here, under the hill. I have not the means to prove it commercially, but I have the eyes and 30 years of looking." She read the last line twice. Then she looked at the survey map. Then she looked at the hillside behind the cooperage, visible through the gap where the wall had fallen. The hillside she had been ignoring because it was covered in scrub alder and looked like nothing. It was too late in the day to do anything about it. She packed the case carefully, wrapped it back in the oilcloth, and carried it into the corner of the cooperage she'd enclosed with a temporary roof of salvaged boards. Her sleeping space, her storage, her small dry world inside the larger ruined one. She set the case beside Reuben's canvas roll, two dead men's gifts, sitting side by side. She slept more solidly that night than she had since arriving in Harrow's Crossing. The weeks that followed had two lives running alongside each other. In the first life, Mabel was doing what she had set out to do, repairing the cooperage. She repointed the walls stone by stone, mixed mortar in a bucket until her arms stopped complaining about it, sourced salvage lumber from a collapsed outbuilding 2 streets over whose owner was glad to be rid of it. She rebuilt the interior frame of the roof. She fitted new boards to the floor where the old platform had been. She was making the place livable, workable, hers. In the second life, she was following Ezra Holt up the hill. She started on weekends, when the short October light meant she couldn't work on the cooperage much past mid-afternoon anyway. She took the survey map and the geological chisels and went up into the scrub alder behind the property. Picking her way through on the line, Holt had marked in pencil on the survey. The hillside was not what it looked like from below. Below it was scrub and thin soil, and the kind of nothing that makes a person assume nothing is there. Up close it was different. The rock that pushed through the soil in occasional outcrops had a different character from the field stone of the foundation, denser, with a crystalline quality that caught the October light in an odd way. She found herself touching it more than was strictly necessary. She found the first seam on a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, almost exactly where Holt's survey indicated. It was a band of pale blue-gray running through a darker granite face, no wider than her palm. She chiseled a small piece free. Ezra's chisel, the right angle, the right weight, and stood in the alder with a piece of stone she couldn't name and couldn't yet evaluate. But she knew what Holt had said about it, and she knew what he'd meant. She started asking careful questions, not in Harrow's Crossing, where questions were a form of currency, and she'd already spent more goodwill than she had. She wrote letters. She found the name of a geology professor at Queen's University in Kingston, from the almanac she borrowed from the post office, and she wrote him a careful letter describing the rock she'd found, the character of the seam, the composition as best she could judge it from Holt's notebook. She included a rubbing of one of his notations. She didn't expect an answer. She sent the letter and went back to work. November arrived with its particular northern intention, the cold that isn't joking, the wind off the high ground that makes you understand why people built houses. Mabel had by now enclosed enough of the cooperage to make the interior habitable. She'd installed a proper stove, bought second-hand from the hardware store. A transaction in which pride had been almost civil, perhaps because she was paying in full, and the corner she slept in was warm enough at night that she didn't think about leaving. She had also begun making barrels. not for anyone in particular, at first. She had found, through Reuben's training and her own searching, that there were 2 orchards in the valley still producing, and 3 farms with apple press operations that required barrels in the fall. She approached them with the straightforward proposition that she could make what they needed faster and cheaper than ordering from Sudbury. 2 of the 3 said yes. She worked at the lathe in the hours, before and after her wall work, the shavings curling around her feet, the smell of cut oak filling the enclosed space. She was good at it, not showing off good but solid and reliable, the kind of good that makes barrels that hold what they're supposed to hold without complaint. The first farmer who came to collect, a man named Oswald Finch, 60-something, the careful type who checks the work before he'll say a kind word about it, tapped each barrel on the side, ran his thumb along the seams, worked the bungs twice. Then he looked at her. Reuben Moss's technique, he said. Mostly. He was a good man. He loaded the barrels without another word, but he paid in full and left with the air of a person who'd file that information away. Winter came. The letters she'd sent to Queens went unanswered. She stopped expecting them. In December, something happened that she had not planned for. A family came through Harrow's crossing in the first real storm of the season, heading north toward a property they'd taken on in the bush, and their horse went lame 2 miles south of town. They came in on foot, the father and mother and 3 children, the youngest carried on the father's back. The hotel was full. A logging crew that had come in out of the same storm, and they stood in the main street in the blowing snow with nowhere obvious to go. Mabel saw them from the hardware store doorway, where she'd gone for lamp oil and been caught by the weather. She didn't think about it in the way that gets thought about. She just walked across the street and asked the mother how many of them there were. 5, the woman said. Her name was Josephine Crane. No relation, as far as she could tell, to Aldous, and she had the expression of a woman who has run out of options and is still holding herself together out of sheer stubbornness. And a lame horse. Come on, Mabel said, and led them back down Coldwater Lane. The cooperage was warm by then. The stove was a good one, and large enough that she could find corners for everyone. The children, once they understood they weren't sleeping outside, became immediately useful in the way that children do when they're warm and feel safe. The 2 older ones helped her to drag out extra boards for makeshift pallets, and the youngest fell asleep against the warmth of the stone wall, with his coat still on. Josephine had a cough that had been sitting in her chest for 2 weeks, rattling and low, the kind that settles in and starts to feel permanent. Her husband, Thomas, who had the particular silence of a man with no good options and the sense to know it, watched her with the quiet worry of someone who doesn't want to say out loud how worried he is. Mabel went to the shelf above the workbench. Reuben Moss had not been a herbalist, but he had been a man who grew up in the North Country, and he kept 3 things. For 3 purposes, all of them descended from whatever people kept before there were doctors in every town. One of them was a tin of dried wild ginger and yarrow that his mother had packed with his tools when he first went out on his own. He had never thrown it out. He had taught her to steep a handful in hot water and add a spoon of honey for chest ailments in winter, the way his mother had taught him, the way her mother had taught her. She made it now and brought it to Josephine without commentary, just the cup and the steam. What is it? Josephine asked. Something that helps, Mabel said. It tastes like the bottom of a creek, but it helps. Josephine laughed, which turned into a cough, and then she drank. She made her 4 times that night and twice the next morning. By the second day, the rattle had eased. By the time Thomas had arranged for a veterinarian in town to see the horse and they were ready to move on, Josephine was breathing clearly. Thomas shook Mabel's hand at the door, which she found she preferred to a great many other expressions of gratitude she could have imagined. What do we owe you? Nothing, Mabel said, which was accurate, since they had nothing to give. Thomas looked at her for a moment, with the particular look of a man storing something up for later. We'll remember it, he said. It sounded like a promise. Word gets around a small town the way heat gets around a room, invisibly, thoroughly, and faster than you'd expect. By the end of January, the story of the family at the cooperage had settled into the general knowledge of Harrow's crossing, softened in some places and sharpened in others, the way all stories are by the time they complete their circuit. What remained stable was the general outline. The Cooper's girl had taken in strangers in a blizzard, and the sick woman had recovered. The town began to look at Coldwater Lane differently. Not warmly, it wasn't that sudden, but the particular quality of the attention changed. People began to stop and speak to her in the hardware store, where before they had been careful to arrange themselves so that speaking wasn't required. Oswald Finch recommended her to 2 more orchards in February. A woman she didn't know left a jar of preserves on the wall outside the cooperage without explanation, which Mabel chose to take as a form of communication. The letter from Queens arrived in March, 4 months after she'd sent hers, addressed in a confident academic hand that suggested someone who had never doubted the adequacy of their penmanship. The professor's name was Thomas Acheson. He explained, a mineralogist with a secondary interest in pegmatitic intrusions in the Canadian Shield, and her letter had been forwarded to him by his colleague in the geology department. He had read her description and Holt's notations. She had included a transcription with considerable interest. The rock she described was consistent with what he'd term a high elbite feldspar, and if her assessment of the seam's extent was accurate, the deposit could be commercially significant. He asked if he might visit in the spring to assess the site. She read the letter twice. Then she walked up the hill, through the softening March snow, to the place where she'd found the seam in October. She stood there for a long time in the quiet. The alder was still bare. The rock face caught the low March sun and threw back a pale light that was different from the fieldstone in the valley. You were right, she said, to nobody, to Ezra Holt, to the hill. Acheson came in May, on a bright day when the alder had leafed out and the creek was running high. He was a compact man in his 50s, with the energetic bluntness of someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors and found indoor manners slightly impractical. He spent 3 days on the hillside with her, taking samples, making notes, cross-referencing against Holt's original survey, with the reverence of one scientist encountering another. On the 3rd evening, sitting at her workbench while she made tea on the stove, he looked up from his notebook with the expression of a man who has confirmed something he'd hoped to confirm. The vein is real, he said. The albite content is high, higher than what's coming out of New Hampshire, which is what everyone in the pottery trade is using, because there's been nothing comparable found in Canada. The silica's promising too. He turned a sample over in his fingers. Ezra Holt knew what he had. He didn't have the means to prove it. No. Acheson set the sample down. You do, I think, if you're willing. She looked at him. I'd like to bring a colleague from the School of Mines to assess the commercial extraction potential. I'd also like, with your permission, to publish Holt's original findings, properly, with attribution, in the Geological Journal. The man deserves the record. He paused. This will become known. People will come. That will change things for you here. Mabel thought about the $11 she'd laid on the county clerk's counter. She thought about Aldous Crane's first offer and Pride's careful condescension. She thought about Vera sitting on the stump at the edge of the tree line. He built the cooperage here on purpose, she said. I believe so, yes. He couldn't get anyone to listen. No. She turned her tea mug in her hands. The attribution matters, she said. His name needs to come first. Acheson nodded. Agreed. She looked at the canvas roll sitting on its shelf beside the cedar case, 2 sets of tools from 2 dead men who had known something the town hadn't believed. Then yes, she said. Bring your colleague. Summer came to Harrow's crossing, and with it, change, the kind that starts in the distance and then one morning is simply where you live. The Geological Survey team arrived in June, 4 men from Kingston with equipment that drew the main street to a standstill. Acheson introduced them to Mabel, who led them up the hillside she had been walking for 8 months and knew now the way she knew the inside of a stave. Duncan Pride came to see her in July, and this time he came without the careful expression and the adjusted patience. He came with his hat in his hands, not literally, but close enough in posture. I owe you an apology, he said, at the cooperage door. She waited. I told you there was no market here, he said. I was wrong, or I was thinking of the wrong market. I know, she said. It wasn't cruel when she said it. It was just accurate. He cleared his throat. There'll be work coming. The survey team says the extraction operation will require supplies, housing, equipment. The town will need to prepare for it, and, well, he turned his hat in his hands. I'd like to start by stocking geological equipment in the hardware store. I don't know what they need. I was hoping you might help me understand it. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had offered to buy her out and suggested she try something more suited. I'll make a list, she said. Aldous Crane, who had been quieter than Pride since the spring, in the way of men who make early calculations and prefer not to draw attention to them, came in August to commission a set of casks for a curing operation he was starting in the next county. He paid in advance, without asking for a discount. She used part of the money to settle the remaining lien on the cooperage. The clerk with the mustache at the county office took the payment with a small nod that managed, she thought, to contain an apology. On the day the lien was discharged, she walked back down Coldwater Lane and found Vera sitting on the same stump at the tree line where she'd sat in September, watching the creek as if the winter and the spring had been a brief interruption. "The floor," the old woman said, by way of greeting. "The floor," Mabel agreed. Vera looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed calibrated for further distances than the creek. "What are you calling it now?" Mabel thought about that. She thought about Ezra Holt, who'd built the place on a secret he couldn't get anyone to hear. She thought about Reuben Mosi, who'd taught her the weight of a tool and the patience of a seam. She thought about that first morning, prizing apart charred beams with a crowbar, her hands bleeding, and the wind coming down off the ridge, and every sensible voice in the town telling her she'd made a fool's bargain. "The same thing Holt called it," she said. Vera raised an eyebrow. Mabel reached into her coat pocket and brought out the small notebook, its water-stained covers soft with handling. She opened it to the last entry she'd found, on a page near the back where Holt had written less carefully, as if to himself. 2 words, underlined once, that had no explanation before or after them. "Coldwater holds." She showed it to Vera, who read it and made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something older than a laugh. "That'll do," Vera said, and turned back to the creek. Mabel tucked the notebook back into her pocket and stood for a moment in the September light. Exactly 1 year from the day she'd walked into Harrow's crossing on foot. $11 and a canvas roll of borrowed tools. Nobody's idea of someone who was about to do anything. She looked up the lane at the cooperage. Her cooperage, stone solid and smelling of oak shavings and lime mortar, the chimney drawing well, the new door hung square and tight in its frame. Reuben Mosi had told her once, near the end, that the thing about learning a trade from someone who loved it was that you didn't just learn the technique. You learned how to look. You learned that most things worth finding aren't on the surface. You learned to listen for the difference between what sounds hollow and what sounds solid, and to trust the difference when you hear it. She walked back up the lane to start the day's work. Thank you for staying with us through every turn of this story. If Mabel's journey moved you, the quiet stubbornness of it, the way one small listening can change everything, please leave us a like and let us know in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. And if you'd like to hear more stories of hidden histories and hard-won places, we'll have another one waiting for you soon.